I am ex-Detective Inspector Walter Henry Thompson and was Winston Churchill's bodyguard for a period of nearly 18 years.
In almost any piece of film you'll see of Britain's great wartime leader, this is the man in the background, anonymous and secret. Until now, his critical role in saving the life of Churchill from a series of attacks has been hidden from the wider public.
He himself intended that he would never be taken alive, and he issued direct instructions to me. I was to have his 4.5 Colt fully loaded. He intended to use every bullet but one on the enemy. The last one he saved for himself.
After the war, Walter Thompson's censored book told just part of the story. His full memoirs were suppressed even by Churchill himself. Only now can we recount the number of assassination attempts on Churchill's life, many foiled by Walter. This series, with unique access to these incredible memoirs, reveals for the first time the story of Walter's life with Winston. Together they traveled thousands of miles on precarious journeys to meet Stalin and Roosevelt and other world leaders. Together they rode with Lawrence of Arabia, dodged German assassins, were nearly shot down by enemy aircraft, lone gunmen, U-boats, and IRA hitmen. This is a story of the political upheavals of the 20th century. Churchill's constant brushes with death and the role played by an ex-post office messenger in preventing an early end to his life.
And with this weapon, he was a dead shot. Anyone that came within range of this weapon would never survive.
Walter and Winston had got back to Britain in early June 1943, after their most frenetic 6 months of travel so far. Not only had they crossed the Atlantic 2 times, but they had also gone the full length of the Mediterranean twice, including a side trip to Turkey. All the way they had been the target of Axis agents and attempts to shoot down their aircraft. Both Walter and Winston had been ill with pneumonia, and Walter had suffered a serious wound in the leg from a shooting accident, but was now fit for duty. Within months, once again in the volatile Middle East, Walter would be facing a team of German assassins which had been parachuted in to kill not just Winston, but the other 2 Allied leaders, Roosevelt and Stalin as well. During July 1943, the Allies moved decisively onto the attack. Pressure on Winston from both the Soviet and US governments to commit himself wholeheartedly to an invasion of Northwest Europe during 1944 was becoming intense. He decided that another high-level discussion with President Roosevelt was essential. This time, the Queen Mary was again chosen for the trip, rather than flying. Walter and Winston set off on the 4th of August. The British contingent landed at Halifax in Nova Scotia and traveled by train to Quebec, where the formal conference was to be held. But within a day, Walter and Winston were on the move again to spend a long weekend with President Roosevelt at his country estate, Hyde Park.
On the way, we rested at Niagara Falls, and the massive pressman asked the Prime Minister, "Do the falls look the same as when you visited them in 1900? Winston smilingly replied, "Well, the principle remains the same. The water still keeps falling."
It was Walter's first trip to Hyde Park, and not a total success.
Of all the places that I visited during the war with Mr. Churchill, in my opinion, Hyde Park was the worst. I mean Hyde Park, New York, not the one up the road. The place was very vulnerable, which meant that it had to be covered by security officers for the whole 24 hours, and everybody that moved about either left or entered the premises was checked by these men. I hated the place. There was no peace there for anyone. The Roosevelts were always on the move. If they wanted something, they meant to have it. Day and night, I had to be on the alert, walking about in the grounds all over the damn place, with a creel on my hip, a hot dog in my hand, and often a basket of sandwiches on my head and my trousers covered with mustard. And to add to all that, very often, a half a dozen Roosevelt grandchildren trailing me wherever I went. I'd rather have checkers in the Blitz than a weekend in Hyde Park any day.
It was obviously a somewhat less than restful interlude, after which the two leaders travelled back to Quebec for what was now codenamed the Quadrant Conference. A target date for a cross-channel invasion of late spring 1944 was now agreed, and a joint planning staff set up. During Quadrant, several of his staff remarked on how tired and peevish Winston seemed, and fortunately, his schedule did allow for a break.
A short holiday had been arranged for Winston by Colonel F.W. Clark at Snow Lake, which is well known for its fine fishing. We all relaxed there, and to my surprise, Winston went out onto the lake one morning at 6 a.m. A Royal Marine messenger had arrived with official boxes, and as I had no worry about security in this retreat miles from anywhere, we both went out in a canoe fishing. One of our hooks got caught in some weeds, and together we leaned over one side to get it free. The result was what might be expected, for neither of us realized how easily a canoe would turn over. We were both thrown into the water, and in swimming to the bank, found we had to make our way through 2 feet of thick mud. Our clothes were sticking to us, but at least we had held onto the canoe. Eventually, very dejectedly, we returned to the lake house, where Winston, on seeing me, very gleefully called out, "What are you trying to do, Thompson? Commit suicide?"
After this break, the British party went back to Washington, where they were again installed at the White House for an 11-day stay.
Before leaving the Americas for England, Winston was invited to Harvard University, where under the strictest security, he had conferred on him the honorary degree of Doctor of Law. The speech he made following this was remarkable for its tone of Anglo-American unity, which may have had considerable significance, for the meetings with President Roosevelt had shown that the latter was not at one with Winston in his idea that the hope of the world was now in the hands of English-speaking peoples.
And I earnestly trust that when you find yourselves alongside of our sailors and soldiers in the battlefields and combats of 1943 and 1944, you will feel that we are your worthy brothers in arms, and you will know that we shall never tire nor weaken, but march with you into any quarter of the world that may be necessary to establish the reign of justice and of law among men.
Doubts appeared in the president's mind from time to time, and to me as an onlooker, it appeared that he was obsessed with the idea that Winston wished to further our colonial rule and empire in the Balkans.
Walter also picked up on the first inklings of what was soon to become a serious cause of dissent between the two leaders.
From the many remarks I heard, the president seemed to have absolute faith in Stalin and in the future of the friendship of Russia and the United States. This feeling persisted until the end of the war. What a tragedy. There is no doubt that Winston's knowledge of Russia, both before and during the war, was such that although he welcomed them as allies, he never trusted them. How right he was, and how wrong was the president. Roosevelt's view of Stalin was emphasized when he remarked to the US ambassador to Moscow, "Stalin doesn't want anything but security for his country. I think that if I give him everything I possibly can and ask for nothing in return, noblesse oblige, he won't try to annex anything and will work for a world of democracy and peace.
This statement was amazing, since Roosevelt could have had no illusions that he was dealing with a man of murderous ruthlessness. Only a few months before, on the 17th of April 1943, the Germans had announced the discovery of mass graves in the Katyn Woods, in the part of eastern Poland which had been occupied by the Soviets in 1939. These contained the bodies of some 4,000 Polish officers who had surrendered to the Red Army and subsequently disappeared. It was obvious that the Soviets had been responsible for the mass killings, but Stalin immediately blamed them on the Nazis, and both Roosevelt and Churchill had to take his protestations at face value. But the writing was on the wall for a worsening of relations between Winston and his great ally. For Walter, it would mean a whole range of new threats. The Big Three, together for the first time, would be a prime target for assassins. Roosevelt's apparent refusal to believe anything but the best of Stalin was ominous, for discussions as to where the three leaders should meet together for the first time were now well underway. Walter, Winston, and the British party travelled back to Britain aboard the battle cruiser Renown, reaching the Clyde on the 20th of September. They had been away for 47 days, and Winston's brief holiday during that time had done little to relieve his exhaustion. His colleagues noted how tired he looked, but there was little time for any further relaxation, for in less than 2 months, HMS Renown was taking him on again on the first stage of the trip to meet Stalin and Roosevelt, eastwards into the Mediterranean via Malta.
Here it was hoped that the conference might be held, but the American security officers were dissatisfied with the arrangements, and it was decided to hold it at Tehran. Moreover, Stalin refused to go as far as Malta, but agreed on Tehran.
Like its neighbour, Afghanistan, Iran had been a cockpit of rivalry between the British and Russian empires since the late 19th century, and its value had dramatically increased with the growing importance of oil in the early 20th. Its previous ruler, Reza Shah Pahlavi, had frequently sought German help to play off the two great rivals. In 1941, when they were finally forced onto the same side, Britain and the Soviet Union had ousted him, put his young son as a puppet in his place, and effectively occupied the country. In addition to its oil, Iran now became important as a route along which supplies could be sent to the Soviet Union. Before the takeover, both the rival German intelligence services, the Abwehr under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris and Section 6 of the SS under Walter Schellenberg, had maintained spy networks in the country. The key one of these for the SS was Franz Mayer, who had managed to evade Allied counterintelligence and was living in Tehran. The Abwehr had a Swiss national named Ernst Moser, who it had recruited in 1938 and sent to Tehran under the cover of a businessman. But what the Abwehr didn't realize was that Moser had already been recruited by the British Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, and was being run as a double agent by its resident in Tehran, Percy Downward. During early 1943, as defeat at Stalingrad shattered German confidence on the Eastern Front, both the Abwehr and Section 6 began to look at ways of interrupting the flow of Allied supplies through Iraq. In March 1943, in what appears to have been a joint operation, 6 saboteurs were parachuted into the country. They were there to prepare for sabotage operations under the direction of Franz Mayer. Alongside his increasing interest in Iran from a sabotage point of view, Schellenberg had stepped up his planning for assassination attempts against the Allied Big Three. French intelligence had warned Winston that plans were in place for an attempt to kill him before the outbreak of war. It is probable that an attempt was considered to kill Churchill and Roosevelt at Casablanca, but news of their meeting there, and not in the United States, reached Schellenberg too late. Certainly, by mid-1943, Schellenberg had set up a joint SS Abwehr team to carry out Operation Long Jump, an attempt to kill one or all of the top Allied leaders when they got together, once their meeting place had been identified. The potential assassins were drawn from two elite German special forces, the Army's Brandenburg Division and the SS's Friedenthaler Jagdverband, or Friedenthal Hunting Group, a unit modelled on the British commandos. This was commanded by the infamous Otto Skorzeny and based at Oranienburg near Berlin. Both units trained hard in all forms of unconventional warfare, including assassination and sabotage, and both used a specialist training camp at Quenzgut on Lake Quenz in Bavaria. Thus the Germans had the means to mount an assassination attempt, and Tehran was one of the places where they had both agents and a large number of sympathizers who could give an assassination squad considerable support, provided the squad could be activated in time. But the British had had an extraordinarily lucky break. In September, another of Schellenberg's agents, Dr. Winifred Oberg, was parachuted in, landing near Tehran. He had been caught up in a Soviet security operation, but before he could be unmasked, he was freed by the Swiss double agent Ernst Moeser in an operation to rescue his Polish girlfriend Wanda Pollock, who was being held in the same prison. Oberg had revealed his identity to Moeser, believing that he was working only for the Abwehr, and Moeser gave him shelter. He was then able to find out the whereabouts of most of the other German agents already in Tehran and put a watch on them. Mercifully for Walter and his fellow bodyguards, the decision to hold the conference at Tehran was only taken at the last moment. But despite an enormous security effort, it was soon being rumored that the Big Three would meet in Tehran. All would now depend on whether the Germans would believe these rumors and how quickly they would act on them. President Roosevelt arrived in Egypt the day after Renown docked, and Winston was able to return the compliment by meeting him at Heliopolis Airport. While in Cairo, the two men conferred with General Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Chinese resistance to the Japanese. Walter again showed his weakness for a pretty woman by being smitten by the beauteous but devious Madame Chiang Kai-shek.
It was quickly realized at the first meeting that Madame Chiang Kai-shek was not only the interpreter, but the prime mover in everything that transpired. She was beautifully dressed and a most attractive woman.
It was during this conference that Walter got his first inkling of a strain in the Churchill-Roosevelt relationship.
During the conference in Cairo, I was instructed one day by Winston to take a letter to Chiang Kai-shek at his villa, inviting him to dinner with Winston and the President, and to await an answer. On my arrival at the villa, I saw the first secretary, who informed me that Chiang Kai-shek was with the President, and on his return would arrange for a reply to the letter to be sent to Winston. I returned to our villa and explained to Winston why I was unable to bring him a reply. He was sitting in a chair looking at some papers, but when I gave him the news, he jumped up and started to walk up and down the room, saying, "He cannot do this to me, he cannot do this to me." He seemed very distressed and went on, "I should have been informed of this meeting so I could have been present." The atmosphere cleared a little before we left Cairo, but at times Winston appeared to be deep in thought.
The British party left secretly for Tehran on the 27th of November. Walter would also have been deep in thought had he known that during the 5 days before then, some 60 more German agents had been parachuted into Iran. The Germans were not sure that the Allied leaders would be meeting in Tehran, but they wanted to be ready if the rumors proved true. The pieces were now in place for a nerve-wracking intelligence game between a German assassination team and Walter and his fellow bodyguards. The flight to Tehran took 6 hours, and Walter abruptly encountered the problems he faced as they landed.
On arrival at the Tehran airport, and from there to the British legation, I was very disturbed at the inadequate security arrangements which had been made, both for our arrival and for the journey to Tehran itself. We were forced to drive at a reduced speed in the town, and far too many people were swarming around our car as we slowly proceeded. The arrangements for our security had been made by a military officer who met us at the airport and informed the Prime Minister that he was arranging for his security and suggested that we travel at a very quick rate to the British legation, now embassy. With him was a number of military police to act as escort. They left just ahead of us in a jeep, which to my surprise had the hood up, thus preventing them from seeing all around. They travelled so fast that they are soon far ahead of our car. As we passed through the main streets, I noticed military police at the junction of every road who came to attention and saluted as we passed. We soon arrived in the principal street of Tehran to find large crowds all over the pavement and roadway, compelling our car to practically stop. Fortunately, no one seemed to recognize us, and we safely reached the embassy. Shortly after our arrival, I was in consultation with the military authorities there in connection with the security, which to me was not satisfactory. I suggested that on any future journeys, the military police in the jeep should keep close to our car, and that the police on the road should face the crowd and not the Prime Minister, thus preventing anyone rushing forward. And at the same time, they would be able to watch those standing about. It was suggested that I brought the matter up to the Provost Marshal, who, on my suggesting the above alterations, became indignant that I should interfere with military matters. At that time, he was far from cooperative, and for the time being, the matter was left there. Shortly after, I was informed that Winston wished to see me urgently, and on going into his room, he said, "What did you notice, Thompson, as regards security from the airport today?" I replied that I was far from satisfied. I then detailed my talk with the military officers, after which he said, "The security arrangements were most unsatisfactory and must be tightened up." I put the matter in your hands, Thompson, as we have definitive information that German agents have been parachuted into the area and attempts are to be made on the lives of us all. Arrangements are in hand for the President to stay with Marshal Stalin.
It may well be that it was this information about German agents being parachuted in which made the Provost Marshal swiftly become more amenable. Fortunately for the Allies, many of the agents were renegade Russians who took the first opportunity they could to contact the Soviet authorities. These immediately arrested a large number of men, among them many of the agents, but no one had any information as to exactly how many had been sent, and therefore how many might have slipped through the net. Walter, his opposite number Mike Riley of the US Secret Service, and the Soviets now knew that an unknown number of enemy agents was still at large. But they didn't know how much these agents knew about the security arrangements which had been made. These were now being urgently tightened, not least because the US Embassy, where Roosevelt had originally planned to stay, was more than a mile from the Soviet and British embassies, which were side by side across a narrow road and relatively easy to guard.
The following morning, the Provost Marshal came to see me with regard to the visit, which had been previously arranged for Winston to visit the President at the American Embassy at 11 a.m. that morning. He suggested that I should go over the route to see if the security arrangements were satisfactory. Only a few people were then aware that the President was staying with Marshal Stalin. As I knew this, I reported to Winston the request of the Provost Marshal and was instructed to send my colleague on a dummy run and not cancel the 11 a.m. appointment. At 10:50 a.m., the Prime Minister said, "Thompson, I want you to go to the American embassy as though I am travelling, and then report back to me as to the arrangements made. The Provost Marshal, my colleague and myself left the embassy and turned into the main road, which was a dual-purpose road. British troops were clearing people from the roadway and the pavements, but the locals were far from helpful and made the soldiers' efforts very difficult. A large crowd was massed at the junction of the roads and was most threatening as we passed. I pointed out to the Provost Marshal that gatherings like that, especially in corners where cars had to slow down, should be moved back out of sight to the approaching vehicles, so as to spoil their aim should they attempt any form of assassination. He thought this unnecessary. We returned from this journey quite safely, and I reported back to Winston that the local inhabitants were being stirred up by German agents and that large crowds were assembling outside the British embassy. British troops were sent out to move them away, but failing the use of actual force, many dodged around the soldiers. More troops were sent out, and eventually the crowd, who were very unruly and hostile, were kept in order, and later in the day dispersed. Constant patrols were kept on the alert, and the gates of the embassy were heavily guarded and kept shut, and any vehicle entering being subjected to the utmost search, as was any unknown person who wished to enter.
Roosevelt's decision to accept the hospitality of a villa in the spacious grounds of the Soviet embassy